Now, this entire video is devoted to only one theory, and it's a classical theory made by a guy named Monroe called Monroes motivated sequence. And just like the parts of a speech where they don't necessarily have to go in exactly the order that I presented, they do have to be achieved in order for a speech to work. For example, if a famous speaker came to campus, they wouldn't necessarily need to spend any time in their own speech establishing their credibility. That issue would have been handled on its own. So maybe somebody else would introduce them and take care of that for them, then they would get up and speak. The same thing's true with Monroe's motivated sequence. There are going to be 5 steps in the model, but they don't necessarily have to go in this order, and depending on what you're trying to sell or convince an audience of, you'll have to spend more time on some sections than on other sections. So remember, don't get locked into the 5-step model. Just remember it as a checklist. These 5 things need to happen, and the order in which you do them might matter, but it isn't required to go this direction. So let's hop into it. This is how most sales routines are done, and that's in fact where they originally developed this theory, was in figuring out how door-to-door salesmen and people who are making marketing pitches would get their ideas across. That's why you'll often see it in infomercials, and that's why this particular video relates to the forum discussion of this week. In this discussion, I want you to find your own examples of infomercials and then talk about them in the discussions. These tend to work a lot better than the earlier discussions, although the forums have been pretty good this term. I'm really happy about those. It's even better when we can work from an example. In fact, some of the discussions we've had on the forum, I've noticed, were best when they did make references to examples. So in this week, we're going to be finding an example of an infomercial and then talking about it in terms of these 5 concepts. So Monroe's motivated sequence, again, as I mentioned before, was written by Monroe, and it deals with how persuasion occurs. The first step, usually going to lead off, but not always required, is the attention step. And that isn't the same as an attention getter, although there is some overlap. It simply means any time in the sales pitch or conversion speech where you get the audience back and lock them into their seats and make them pay attention. For example, yes, the beginning of an infomercial might have something crazy happen, like they always have somebody failing to do something normal, like somebody trying to open a carton of milk and it basically explodes all over them. And then it goes to black and white and music plays and a big red X appears on the screen or something. It gets your attention. But it also keeps getting your attention later on through use of color, editing, music, word choice, and so on. So remember, this is a goal that, yes, you do accomplish at the beginning of the presentation, but needs to come back in later. Otherwise, you might lose us. Some of you might have seen this happen, where you heard somebody giving a sales pitch that started really strong and then kind of got boring. What happened is they forgot that attention is something you need to keep bringing up in your presentations as you go. So attention is anything you do to keep the audience engaged. Now, this is the more meaty portion of the elements of the speech. Need. This is where you show us either that there's a problem or that things just aren't as great as they could be. So things might not be terrible now, but you're letting us know about a new opportunity. So anytime you're spending time explaining to us that our lives could be better than they are right now, or that there's a problem around that we could fix, that's a need step. Here's a good example from recent advertisements about prescription drugs. Many of you probably had never even heard of restless leg syndrome until you saw an ad for drugs that would help handle it. See, that's an example of one of those needs where you might not even have known this problem existed until the person made you aware of it. So need might work that way. But need could also be a classical example of, hey, you want to have some really good food? Everybody likes good food. Here's an example of a place you could go to get some good food. So the need is what you're trying to get the audience to deal with. Now, the satisfaction step is probably the step that people misunderstand the most. They think that this means this is where you present the solution to the problem. That's only partially true. In addition to presenting the solution that you want the audience to take, you also present all of the alternatives, time permitting. Here's a simple example. Let's suppose you have a headache. So my discussion of the headache would be the need section of the speech. But then when I talk about the things you could do to get rid of the headache, I'm not going to tell you just one. I'm not going to just tell you about the medication that I'm selling in this commercial. I might compare it to other medications Or I might say, hey, taking a nap is good for headaches, but nobody has time for that. Or drinking enough water. I'm already drinking enough water and that didn't work, so that's not the reason I have a headache. So satisfaction is where you don't just give us one solution, you give us several. And the nice thing about this is that this is genuinely ethical, as long as you do it honestly, as long as you present honest alternatives to the solution that you're suggesting. Basically, you're telling the audience, here are your options, and you're laying them out kind of fairly. Then you visualize. Visualization doesn't necessarily mean showing it to us. It means helping us imagine a world in which each of these solutions plays out. So let's get back to that headache. Some of you might have had some pain medication issues in the past. So if I said something like Tylenol, your reaction might be, yeah, it might help my headache, but it tends to make my stomach upset. See, visualization would include both the solutions and the disadvantages of each of those issues. So a headache might be solved by taking a nap, but I don't have time to take a nap. That'd be visualization step. I might also talk about another kind of medication that's just too expensive. Things like that. This is where you lay out how each of the options would work. And then, ideally, the audience ends up choosing your solution because it ends up being the best of all possible worlds. The thing I love about this model, again, is that it's not only ethical, it's realistic. Most of the problems we have in our lives don't have a single clear answer. Usually there's 4 or 5 possibilities and you're choosing the best one. When I moved to Newburgh, I wanted to take my daughter to a school, obviously. But there were 3 or 4 options. No one option struck me as being the most perfect option, so we chose the one that had most of the benefits we wanted and had disadvantages that we could handle. For example, she's in a really small school. The thing I'm concerned about is that as she gets older, unless the school does a really good job of recruiting, her class size is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller, and that might be awkward for her socially. So that's a problem, but all the other advantages of her school, I think, are great. So visualization is where you walk us through all those options and help us see why your solution's the best one. Now let's suppose that's all worked. Step 5, call to action. This is where you tell us what we're actually going to do. It's not enough just to persuade us mentally. You've got to actually make us go do something. And notice how that lines up with the speech that you're required to do for the persuasive speech in the class. It's not just a mental persuasion, it's a behavioral change. This in the infomercial is where they would say, so call now, or here's the store you can buy it at, or our operators are standing by, or here's the website you can click on. If you see the ad or infomercial on YouTube, then it probably has an embedded link within it and says, hey, click here right now. Or pop-up ads also have those click here now moments. You're moving past the point of simply saying, I've persuaded you. Now that I've persuaded you, here's how to do something about that thing that we just discussed. Now, call to action is usually going to come near the end, but depending on how long the presentation is, it might happen more than once. A good example of this would be some YouTube commentators have occasional little commercial breaks within a single YouTube video to give you multiple options to click on a link that will support their homepage or their channel. Call to action, again, could happen more than once. So the attention step and the call to action step are usually going to bookend the speech, but it's not only those times you need to think about those issues. Now, one final thing. Notice how this 5-step model could actually fit the structure of your speeches in the class. The attention step could basically be accomplished in the intro. Then the 3 main points of your speech could be need, satisfaction, visualization, and then you could have the call to action tucked into your conclusion. So this is an alternative option for some of you who might want to use this on the persuasive speech for the final. So again, back to forum number 5. Go find examples of infomercials and feel free to find weird and wacky ones. I always love it when you guys find things that I've never seen before so that I can then use them in later classes. Go find an example of an infomercial and talk about how it fits some of these models.